We're starting today. Well, we're getting a little later every day, aren't we?
Yeah, we're getting a little later, although I think we're, I don't know, yeah, I think breakfast and
Sure.
just, I think we're also getting a little more efficient, but a little later.
Yeah, that makes sense. Saturday mornings,
Yeah.
later in the school year, it's going to get colder, harder to get out of bed.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me kind of situate us. We are in this is our fourth session in a seven session course on Galatians. So this is the fourth one. So first week was on overview, establishing how we read hermeneutics of Scripture, exegesis, and then establishing kind of the historical context, what's going on in the Galatian church, and then we had a week on chapter 1, a week on chapter 2. So last time was the exciting chapter 2, conflict between Paul and Peter at the showdown in Antioch. Not quite a gunfight at OK Corral, but something like that. It was pretty interesting. And then today we transition into Paul's main arguments. So we finally left his ethos argument, the argument that says he is not a proper apostle. We'll cover all that. Let me get started by making a brief comment on what we're doing here. I think it's always oops. How did that? Okay. Brief meta discourse. Let's step outside real quick. As I explained, I bring this up every single time, that when we read something like Galatians, a lot of humility is involved, and some uncertainty involved. The uncertainty is exacerbated by the fact that Paul knows the people at Galatian churches. I mean, he knows the people in the churches there. He actually brought them to Christ. So he's preached to them his gospel. He likely has favorite passages from the Old Testament. So when he cites them, he's probably evoking arguments that he doesn't have to say. Okay, does that make sense? There's all kinds of stuff going on here that we might not be able to pick up. So we have to just kind of accept that our reading is going to be somewhat incomplete. There's going to be some imperfection to our reconstruction of his original intention. That's just part of the course. And also we also talked about that the problem of the epistle letters themselves, right? They are in response to situations to solve a particular problem. We don't know the problem. We don't have anybody describing it to us a problem. We don't have anybody summarizing who he's arguing against. All we have is one side of the argument. That's challenging. So we're trying to reconstruct what he's arguing against based on his argument. Okay. And so I don't know if when you read a lit crit, when you read an article that's arguing somebody else, you can kind of have a sense of what they're arguing against. But it'd be always nicer just to go look down the footnotes and grab the original article, read that, and go, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, you've probably done that in some of your research, and it's like, that's what's going on. But that's what we're unable to do. Okay, so here's the thing to remember: Paul was not writing to clarify what he said before, nor to explain a new point of his gospel. That's also not very helpful to us, because he's not really trying to exposit anything, but we're recalling. Paul's writing to defend his gospel against another gospel. Okay? So, Paul does not represent his gospel in a coherent, systematic way. Rather, he refers to various elements of his gospel for the purpose of arguing for the validity of the whole. He picks and chooses the part that makes sense. The other parts he's just going to ignore, because those are not under attack, or not really relevant to the discussion. Okay? So that's one problem. So, to understand what the epistle means, we need to reconstruct Paul's gospel, understand what the gospel is, how is it under attack, and how he defends it. The three different elements of attack, defense, and the gospel itself that he would present in a systematic way without being attacked and without being in a polemical situation. Those are three different distinct concepts that we kind of need to keep separate, even though they bleed into each other and intersect with each other. Okay, that's kind of a brief meta discourse on what we're doing here. Okay. Also, for the sake of bringing some coherence to the lectures, because he's jumping around, okay, I can't jump around with him, okay, because then I'd be jumping around too. So sometimes I need to take a topic and move it back, where he's going to talk more over here. So for example, we're going to run into that right now. He's going to talk about the Spirit, and we're going to talk about the Spirit in the last session. Okay, we're going to dive deep into Paul's understanding of the Holy Spirit, because that's Galatians 6. But he's going to mention it up here. Instead of going to mention Galatians, he's going to mention Spirit all the way through. And then I'm going to just push it all back. We'll make a couple comments on it, but any kind of systematic discussion will have to move back. Okay. So that's the nature of the beast. When he's writing to people he already knows, he's just throwing things out. Okay? He's just like, you know this, you know this, you know this. Boom, boom, boom. Any questions on this? Okay. So let's do a quick review like we always do, because 2 weeks is a long time. I hope that when we review, also from the very get-go, there's a way in which some of these start sinking in and become and go deeper into our understanding. Today I'm going to skip the summary of the Judaizers. We talked about them multiple times now, but let's kind of remind ourselves how Paul is defending his apostleship. Remember, the Judaizers consider Paul a nobody, right? He's not one of the 12, not from the Jerusalem church, and Paul's defense on chapter 1 is big time. My apostleship is not from humans, right? It is not. I'm not a people pleaser. I'm not that kind of a person. Okay. Rather, he was a Jewish zealot, a strict Pharisee. The last person in the world you would think who want to relax Jewish rules and requirements to please Gentiles. I mean, that's just not Paul. Okay, that's not his tradition. So he's like, I'm a Pharisee. I'm not that kind of a person. Okay, that makes no sense to think that I'm that kind of person. So, and then he received his commission as an apostle by a divine revelation, directly encounter with Jesus. His gospel is from God, not from men. Okay? So the Judaizers, the people who are attacking Paul in the Galatian church, saying he's not from Jerusalem, he's not one of them. Paul's response is, damn right. I am not one of them. Okay, I am not one of them. I get it straight from God, straight from Jesus. Okay. And he was very. Remember, he swore. I swear this is the truth. I did not go to Jerusalem. When I was in Jerusalem, I was there very shortly. I only met a couple people. I did not go to the Jerusalem discipleship training class. Okay, I didn't go to didn't do their class. Didn't do their school. I did not learn from them. And chapter 1 then was this big long discussion on. To prove that Paul's gospel was not for men. Paul recounted for so many years he did not go to Jerusalem, and when he did, it was only for 2 weeks when he met Peter and James. Nobody else. He swears by this. Okay. Big emphasis on the source of his gospel being not from Jerusalem, which is a very good move. If he argues that, well, I'm loosely connected with Jerusalem. If he says, well, my gospel has been approved by Jerusalem, then he is in de facto admitting the authority of the Jerusalem church, right? I think that's the problem. Is he can't go the other way. He can't say, well, Jerusalem church people knows me, they like me, they approve of me. That doesn't work. That doesn't work at all. Because then by then he would be affirming their authority. So he doesn't go that direction. And the direction he goes instead, in chapter 2, was to bring up the Jerusalem Council. Okay? And this is what we talked about last week. With Jerusalem Council, from Acts 15, there was a question about Gentiles and circumcision. Do Gentile Christians need to be circumcised? Do Gentile Christians need to follow Jewish law? Not all of them, just the major ones, the boundary markers. Your Sabbath, circumcision, food laws, the 3 big ones. Do they need to follow it? So Paul, now remember, Acts 15 Slaughter was an ecclesiastical issue. Churches have problems, get together for a convention or a council, discuss it, make a statement, send out letters everywhere, establishing the position of the church. Paul saw it, actually, it was kind of a prophetic event. It was by revelation that he went up there, and this is what God, it was a test, not of Paul, but of the Jerusalem leaders, to see if they can recognize what is right. Because if they can't, then the whole thing falls apart. But he was very pleased that the Jerusalem Council affirmed what Paul received directly from God, which meant that even though we're different people, different bodies, different ecclesial institutions, we're working, the same God is working together. So to Paul, that was very, very affirming. The council agreed with Paul that Gentiles would not have to be circumcised. Now here's the big part, and the part that doesn't show up in Acts 15 at all, which is the understanding of the Jerusalem Council that somehow the Gentile mission was handed to Paul. Mission to the Jews handed to Peter. So we have now in the early church 2 major franchises, 2 major areas of domains of responsibility, and 2 major apostles, Peter and Paul. Okay, they're on equal terms with each other. That's huge for Paul's defense of his apostleship. You got people in Galatia, which we already talked about as being a Gentile church, saying, our authority comes from Peter. And Paul, with one stroke of the storytelling, has said, no, that person has no authority. Peter has no authority in Galatia, because you're a Gentile church. And the representative who claim authority from Peter has no authority. Okay? They're violating the terms of the Jerusalem Council. I have authority. Okay? So that's he just thinks he's recounting stories. No. There's big time application to this in terms of his authority, in terms of the Judaizers' authority, or the lack thereof. And then finally, the showdown in Antioch. Okay, that's how the chapter 2 ended, in which the Jerusalem leaders, the act of Peter himself, the other apostle, okay, was shown to be a hypocrite. Right? He actually went there and he started doing something that he did not believe in based on pressure from James as the leader of the Jerusalem church and what he called the circumcision party, the group that really wanted Gentiles to obey Jewish laws. Okay, Jewish laws. And he succumbed to peer pressure. So who's the people pleaser now? It's Paul or is it Peter? And so they didn't stand on their conviction. They actually bent toward it, and including Barnabas. And remember that in Acts 15, what's interesting is right after Jerusalem Council, there's a little note about how Paul and Barnabas split up over the person of John Mark. And I would say that's undoubtedly true, but that's probably not the whole story. That I think Galatians tells a different reason why they split up. Okay, it would not at all be surprising for Paul and Barnabas to split over this issue. I think Paul experienced a degree of betrayal that he found shocking. Okay, by Peter, but especially by Barnabas. The person who founded a Gentile mission decided to refuse to eat with Gentiles, where he has done so previously, all this time. Suddenly, because of pressure from people in Jerusalem, decided to back away because of the presence of some people who were there. Okay, imagine that degree of lack of integrity from Paul's perspective. Like, wow, you have no convictions. How dare you do this? Okay, he's furious. Okay, so just imagine what how the chapter 2 ends, and that's that recounting of his story, of his conversion, and all the way to culmination of the conflict, the showdown in Antioch. I think defenses apostleship and takes down the Judaizers' backing. I think completely and utterly. Okay, we have in every way shown who is a person you should be listening to. Okay, now let's get down to the arguments. Let's get down to brass tacks. Okay, so chapter 2 ends with a transition to Paul's main arguments, and so if you miss the first 2 chapters, what you miss is a big long narrative, and now suddenly the theology pops in chapter 3. Okay, so and as we do this, we always do a little summary of the theology we have covered so far. We ran into a couple things. For those of you who've been in this class more than before the semester, this is so familiar now. It's like, oh man, not again. But there's always new people here, and I always have to repeat this. The word gospel.
Good news.
Good news. Thank you, Paul. Okay. Good news. A gospel does not mean good news in the generic sense.
Oh, that's right. It doesn't mean good news. This is what, like 5 years I think we've been doing this?
Yes. And we do this every single time and every single week. The gospel does not mean good news in the generic sense, but good news in a narrow sense of the proclamation of the accession of a new king or emperor God. And in the New Testament, we're talking about proclamation that Jesus, the Jewish Messiah, has become the king. And when we're talking about Jesus, the Messiah becoming king, we're talking about the eschatological king. We're talking about the king of the final age. So when you're talking about gospel, you're talking about Messiah, you have to think eschatology, you have to start thinking in terms of how did the Jewish people and then early Christians understand how the progress of history works. Okay? But Jesus has triumphed over sin and death. He is now the king of the world in this new age. The new age, the final age, has begun. Now, a quick comparison, and I never got on changing these colors, do I? I always forget. I gotta change colors, and I never do. Okay, Old Testament eschatology, Old Testament understanding of the future. Right now, the prophets are talking. They're saying, "Hey, this is the former days, the reign of the Gentiles. You got the Assyrians, you got the Babylonians. Eventually, come the Greeks. New Testament, the Romans. The Gentile rulers are ruling over us. And why shouldn't they? Well, they shouldn't because they're idol worshippers. They don't know God. We know the God. We know Yahweh. We know the Creator God of the universe. We are right about God. They're wrong. So God is going to vindicate us on a particular day called the Day of Yahweh, in which God will come and wipe out or destroy their power and establish the Jewish people as the leader of the world, as the ruler of the world, either directly or via Messiah. And those would be the latter days, during which God reigns through Jerusalem. And remember that passage in Isaiah, and Mount Zion will be lifted above all other mountains. It'll be the tallest mountain in the world. I don't think they meant that, literally, but in terms of significance. Okay, and then God's Torah will flow out from it to the ends of the world, and then people will flow to it. So let's go to Jerusalem. Let's go learn the Torah of Yahweh from the Jewish people. I mean, that's the idea. Okay, and that's that whole passage about. And then the nations will no longer learn war, and they were beating plowshares, swords into plowshares, and all that good stuff. Right? And you're familiar with that passage, and that's the vision. Okay, that's the Old Testament vision, and will come on the day of Yahweh and in the last days. New Testament, some things change. And we'll actually talk about the change a little bit in this passage as well. But the New Testament, there's a realization by the New Testament writers, and that didn't quite work out. Okay? And it didn't quite work out because Jesus, the Messiah, has come, he died, which is a problem, and then he resurrected, which is a bigger problem. Okay? Dying Messiah is bad enough because the Messiah is not supposed to die. At least not get killed by his enemies and in a shameful death on the cross. But resurrection is more problematic. We don't think that's a problem, but it is a huge problem because their understanding is that the day of Yahweh is accompanied by massive resurrection. Everybody getting resurrected. And then there's the people who are righteous, they're rewarded, the people who are punished. I mean, that was what's expected. There's no expectation of a single resurrection. None in the Jewish mindset. So when you have people working this out, I would say Paul, and then Paul was like the first one who actually systematically started working this out, and later and the other writers as well. What they start seeing is, okay, now the resurrection marks the beginning of the final age. We know that. That's the sign of the final age. So what does that mean then? Well, then contrary to what you see with your eyes, the final age must have begun. Okay, the final age is now here. But the only thing that's unexpected is that this current age did not end. So what we have is a continuing of the satanic realm, and then the beginning of the final age. And what we're expecting then is that the God of Jesus will come back again and put an end to the satanic realm and a complete consummation of the kingdom of God. Okay. So the day of Yahweh in the Old Testament, that line, is now actually stretched out into a period of time rather than a single day. So the Old Testament saw as one event, and the New Testament becomes two events into a period in which we now live in. The time between the times, as some people say, or the now and the not yet, and all kinds of other phrases. So the question here then is, this is the basic worldview of Eschaton, Jesus the Messiah. So joining this kingdom, being part of the covenant people, is in reality moving from one kingdom to the other. Okay, to leave this and go join there, but you still bodily live on this earth, right? This is two kingdom on earth at the same time, moving over. So, question I think people have is, well, who actually gets to go? Right? Who actually gets to go? Well, okay. Well, the Christians would say, yeah, we believe in Jesus, right? The Jews would believe something somewhat different. Okay. So what we have here is an understanding of the word justification. Actually, let me don't throw that word out just yet. Let me kind of figure out what we mean by. Let me back this up. How do you know who's in there, and on what basis do you move from one to the other? The Jews, look at the top line. The Jews believe that God is the judge, and He will vindicate the Israelites over against the Gentiles. The Gentiles are wrong. They're a bunch of idol worshippers. We saw that last week, right? The Jews are wrong. The Gentiles are wrong about God. We're right about God. We're the chosen people of God. We have Moses. We have the Ten Commandments. We have the Torah. We have Abraham. We have all the stuff that God's given us. We're the right people, and we're just waiting. Okay, and so who among us will be part of the covenant people? Well, is it all Jews? Everybody who's has Abraham's blood? Oh no. The story of the Old Testament has shown that only the faithful Jews. There's a sense of faithfulness. There's a sense of it's shrinking down. It's not all Jewish people, but a remnant. Because other people started worshiping. I mean, you have Abrahamic children who worshipped other gods. In the storyline, if you get like the Old Testament, you have even Davidic kings who worshipped other gods. They have fallen away. So it can't be actually just Abraham's children. It has to be something like those who practice works of the law. Those people who distinguish themselves as Jews, who are self-consciously Jews. We're the true Yahweh worshippers, and we will be true Yahweh worshippers by the way we practice the Torah. We practice Torah in a very narrow way, in a strict fashion. That makes us true people of God. That tells people the true people of God. And so, basically, a Torah keeping as a program to identify who the true people are, also as a way of actually forcing God to show up. Okay, so the Pharisees believe that if you get the whole nation to practice Torah more faithfully, God will come and restore them. Because there's some certain logic to that, because what happened in the Old Testament was when they were not keeping the Torah properly, well, actually, they rebelled against God and started worshiping other gods, which broke not a commandment, but the first commandment. Okay. But if you keep Torah better, you will get your Abrahamic blessing and the restoration of the land and that kind of stuff. Old Testament understanding. What Jewish understanding. Paul's understanding, we believe, is that it's not. What we have is God's going to vindicate a new covenant people over against the unbelievers. Okay? Not Gentiles anymore, people who don't believe in Jesus. And we have a new Israel, a new covenant people, and these people are going to be known as people who believe in Jesus as God's Messiah. Okay. That marks off these people as those ones who will be vindicated in the future. Okay. So there's a future vindication. Right in the present, we know who they are. These people who believe in Jesus as God's Messiah, they will be in the future vindicated. They will be part of the new Israel. Okay. So if we talk about justification in Paul's letters, it refers to the final vindication of God's people over idolaters, and they're talking about a present anticipation of the future vindication. If we have a future vindication that's happening, how do we know in the present who they are? And these are the things that marks off who is justified and who is not. Who are the people who will be vindicated in the future? So, any question on this? Okay, just still kind of review. Okay, actually last one. So we're going to jump into Galatians 3, so last chance.
Oh.
Go for it.
So, this would be the Pharisees' view, but there were other sects of Jews as well. How
Yes.
does that fit in?
So for example, I mean, the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. So that makes life easy. You just kind of do your thing and you die. They had let's say you're dead. So end the story, right? So the other sect of Jews, so here's the thing, okay? When I talk about Jews believe, I'm grossly generalizing. And there's nothing you can do about that. The scholarly tendency right now is to actually multiply variety. And we're swinging the pendulum back. In academic circles, there's always pendulum swing. And what we have done is we're swinging to extreme diversity, in which now you have scholars who say you shouldn't say anything about first century or Second Temple Judaism. There's nothing you can say, because there's so many varieties. And then there's those among us who say, yes, but there's got to be something that's not Jewish. Okay? So if you talk about a person who says, okay, I believe that I will reincarnate, and when I die, my soul will transmigrate into a new body, and this will keep going on and on forever and ever and ever. Okay? I can make a very good argument that is not a Jewish idea. It would not fit into any Jewish idea in first century or second Temple Judaism. Okay, that is not a Jewish thing. So if you can say that there are certain things that are not Jewish, then there are ways to draw some lines. And the way to draw some lines are big issues, such as if you ask Jews, who are you, and what is the problem with the world? They would say, well, we are the chosen people of God. The problem with the world is that the idolaters are running roughshod over it. Okay, and that needs to be fixed. Okay. If you can answer those big kind of questions, but in detail, you're right. The sects work variously. Some have rejected it completely. The apocalyptic, such as the Essenes, hung out in the Dead Sea, wait for God to show up. They're saying the whole Jerusalem crowd is corrupt. The temple is corrupt. Let's go and what we call today cult. They sit in the Dead Sea. They sit in the Dead Sea area and they waited, and we don't know what happened to them. We found their library. Okay, we have the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have their libraries. Like, oh, that's interesting, and they have description of how they live and what their ceremonies are and the weird things that they believed. Okay, multiple Messiah, the conflict between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. A lot of very interesting stuff that goes on. And then you move on to Jews who mix together with Greek philosophy. So they're all kind of there. So I'm being somewhat reductionistic, but to get into the whole range, that's another class in itself. So. But here the thing is, I want to focus on the Jewish aspect in which Paul's addressing, because Paul's addressing because this Jewish aspect influences the Judaizers. Okay? The Judaizers are very much in line with the Torah keeping aspect program, which is Christians need to do some of these Torah keeping stuff, because that's just what Jews do, what Christians do. Where Christians are really just Jews who believe Jesus is the Messiah. So that's their perspective. Where Paul says no. Okay, no. Okay.
Question.
Yes.
So in Paul's day, was there a sense that mission to the Jews is a higher call than mission to the Gentiles?
Well, Paul obviously didn't think so. Paul obviously did not think so, even though the way he did it has been traditionally been, let me go to the synagogue first. From Paul's understanding, eventually what we run into in Galatians, there are no Jews or Greeks, or Gentile. There's no distinction. Everything is made one in Christ. So I would think Paul certainly would not feel that way, but some Jews might. That's not a surprising thing to think about. There is a sense in which, well, they really should buy into this. This is their story. So you want the Jews to become evangelized and preached, the gospel preached. I don't know if you're familiar with Rodney Starks. He's a sociologist who does church history. Okay, which is a problem. His church historians don't like him because he's bringing in numbers. he's doing quantifiable stuff like into history. It's like, whoa, doing a population calculation, cities and growth. He's actually creating numbers to prove his thesis, which drives historians up the wall. Numbers, we can study this. Okay, what is that? Using statistics and that kind of things. So interesting, one of the things that he proposes in The Rise of Christianity, a lot of people reject this, but it's an interesting hypothesis. And his argument is, if you look at the story in the Acts, there are a lot of Jews who became Christians. Okay? Makes sense, right? A lot of Jews became Christians. In fact, that's how Paul's churches always start. Jews in synagogues, they become Christians, and then a Gentile God-fearers join in, and that becomes a nucleus of the Pauline church. Okay, and then you have Jews who did not convert, and they attack them. Then we have major conflict. Okay, but the idea that, and then when you get to the Council of Jamnia in about 80, I'm losing my dates. The Jewish Council, the kind of the post-destruction Jerusalem Council, in which the kind of really the starting point of modern Judaism, if you will. The modern Judaism is really transformed by the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. They made it very clear that you should not be a Christian. You cannot be a Christian to be Jewish. So that anti-Christian polemics in Jewish circles began in kind of the late 1st century onward. Okay, and Starks reads, and so people have read that and go, oh yeah, okay, that just means that Jews were resisting Christians. But Starks reads it differently. He says, no. What's going on there is that it actually is evidence that Jews are converting in mass numbers. Because otherwise, why would you need that? Why would you need an injunction if Christianity was not making mass inroads into synagogues and Jews? If you think about it, that makes a whole lot of sense, especially for an exilic Jew or diaspora Jew. And actually, after the 125 Bar Kokhba revolution, in which the Romans came in, and not only the temples already destroyed in 70, in 125 they declared Jerusalem to be a Jews-free city. They kicked all Jews out of Jerusalem. Everybody is in diaspora. Okay, a diaspora Jew, you can't do temple. You have no sacrificial system. All of that's gone. Becoming a Christian actually is quite attractive. You have some very similar idea. You share the similar storyline. So the argument is that many, in fact, most Jews became Christians. That's what Starks argues in his books. Like, well, that's a plausible argument. And then if you think, well, where are they now? Well, once you become a Christian, you stop being Jewish, and then 2 generations later, you're gone. You just blend into the Christian Gentile world, and so that's kind of his argument that he makes. He actually makes the one other argument, which the details I'm not familiar with, but it's the 2nd or 3rd century Christian tract against Christians practicing too much Jewish cultic practices. Now, why are Christians? Why is there an injunction against being too Jewish? Because they're pulling Jews in large numbers, and that would be his argument. Like I said, there's not enough evidence to really to prove anything, Just in history, you get you work with what you get, right? But he makes some interesting arguments. So I don't know how we got on that. Sorry. Oh no. Which one has priority? So anyway. Whoa. Sorry. Whoa. Okay. Let me move on. Let's get to Galatians 3. Wow. Okay. So the previous chapter ends with Paul's speech to Peter, remember? And he talked about you Jew being a Jew, you act like Gentiles, so why do you want to make Gentiles act like Jews? And then he talks about, I have been crucified with Christ, not I who live, but Christ lives in me. And so we have this crucifixion idea and oneness with Christ idea, which we will cover later, not today, okay? But they're already showing up, okay? So what it begins with is this: O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you, before whose eyes Jesus the Messiah was publicly portrayed as crucified? I just want to know one thing. Did you receive the Spirit from the works of the Torah or from hearing with faith? Are you so foolish? Having begun with the Spirit, are you now perfected with the flesh? Did you experience so many things in vain, if that is even conceivable? Does he who supplies the Spirit to you and works miracles among you do so from your works of the Torah or from your hearing with faith? Okay. So let's walk through this a little bit. First of all, he's not insulting their intelligence, obviously. He's not saying you're idiots. But it's more rhetorical. Okay. It's actually his lack of comprehension, or their lack of comprehension, is surprising to Paul. So, he marveled at them back in chapter 1, verse 6. I marvel that you so quickly departing from the true gospel, right? To embrace another gospel. That's back in chapter 1, verse 6. So he's just really surprised, okay? And the surprise expresses disappointment and so forth. Bewitch is actually a sorcery word, a magic word. So to put a spell on something. So his idea is somehow that this could not have happened. There's no rational reason why you would do this. What you're doing, following the Judaizers and getting circumcised, is so irrational and so shocking that it has to be an act of magic. Okay, this is rhetorical, okay? But he's really saying there's no rational basis for doing what you're doing. Okay, so who's bewitched you? Okay, this just seems impossible to believe this. He's not really saying it's really witchcraft, okay? Obviously. It's rhetorical. Remember, rhetoric thinks he's using hyperbole. The Judaizers are not practicing witchcraft. The content of the gospel, here it is: the Messiah as crucified. Okay. This is really, we can spend a long time unpacking this phrase. Now, actually, I kind of talked about it a little earlier already. Okay, if you think Messiah, okay, Jews expect that. Judaism says, yeah, we're just Jews who believe in the Messiah. Okay, but this Messiah got himself killed, crucified, executed in the most shameful way possible by the Gentiles. That takes you to something else. That takes you into something that's a little unexpected, which means it needs to be worked out. Okay, it needs to be worked out. And Paul is someone who actually has worked this out. Okay, this changes a Jewish eschatology. It undermines Judaizers' eschatology and their understanding of who is in and who is not in. So Paul is accessing this thing. But the problem here is he doesn't go into detail. Right? You notice that, right? He says, "Look, this is obvious. I clearly portrayed before you the Messiah was crucified," which really should undermine everything that Judaizer says. Right? Except we're like, for us, but we didn't hear what you said to them. Right? We missed that lecture, Paul, but they haven't. So he is invoking this as a way of saying this undermines everything. Okay? Now we're going to get hints. We're going to get snippets of this later. Okay? We're going to get hints of why does Paul think that a crucified Messiah will undermine the Judaizers' argument, okay, and will make their argument seem completely irrational. It's going to show up later, so we can't talk about it now. But just want you to understand that he sees this phrase, this juxtaposition, this what would you call an oxymoronic juxtaposition, because messiahs don't get crucified, as being the significant kind of the crux for understanding what's going on. Okay, so we have to move on because he moves on. He leaves us hang. He doesn't leave them hanging, but he leaves us hanging. He keeps doing this. The second, so that's one quick argument he throws in there. Messiah is crucified, therefore Judaizers are wrong. I can't believe you believe this. Thanks, Paul. Not much there. Okay. The other thing, the next appeal is to the experience of the Spirit. Okay? Now, if you look at this, we have two ways of accessing God and Spirit. We have the hearing from faith, and we have works of the Torah, both of which we'll discuss in more detail. But what he's saying really is you have two ways, and both of them, the end result is receiving the Spirit. Right? Did you receive the Spirit from the works of Torah or from hearing of faith? There's two of these. Now, which one is it? What's the obvious answer? Right? Now, well, the answer, obviously, for them is, we did it from hearing with faith. We received the Spirit from hearing with faith. So, now, we're going to talk about Spirit later. We already talked about that last week. Paul leaves us hanging on this. But, something we need to point out right here is this. And I think, let me make this clear. This argument only works if Spirit is an experienced reality. Okay? Observable, subjectively experienced reality. Okay? For people in certain church traditions, when did you receive the Spirit? There we go. I know exactly the date and time. I was there. I felt it. For many of us are just like, did you receive the Spirit with the hearing of the faith or from works of the law? I don't know. I don't know when I received the Spirit, right? So you see the problem. So for this argument to work, the people in Galatia, the churches there, when they became Christian, when they heard the gospel, they received the Spirit in a powerful, experienced way. That's the only way for this argument to work. Otherwise, it'd be a stupid question. But for Paul, it's like, did you receive the Spirit from hearing the law with faith? Well, yeah, see, I remember. You guys are speaking in tongues. You sort of fall in love. You just, all kinds of things are happening to you. Okay? So, question?
Okay, so, verse 4 and 5 also mention that they also experience miracles and wonders.
Exactly.
Beyond just
Exactly. So all the things that we're going to include all those things, okay? All the marks of the Spirit in terms of wonders and powers and signs. Did you get all that from works or from faith? And the answer is, we got it from hearing with faith. Okay, we got it with you when you were here with us. Okay, so why are you working backwards toward the works of the law and toward the flesh? Right? Why do you? Well, you already got it. Why do you need to add to it? Okay, so that's kind of Paul's argument as well. So this is a significant argument about what's going on in Galatian church. And the word flesh shows up, and we need to talk about that, and later in more detail in chapter 5 and 6. So a lot of things he leaves us hanging. And I keep saying he bounces back and forth in arguments because they already know his arguments, and we don't. Okay. So I just want to point that out. Any questions on this section? On these 5 verses here. Okay. So Christ crucified, Spirit, and we'll cover both of these. But the experience is unmistakable. Okay. Next passage. We're gonna dive into. So he calls them foolish. He says this is incomprehensible what you're doing because you're moving in the wrong direction, and you already know Christ crucified, which makes it completely irrational to buy into the Judaizers' argument. And now we get into why. Okay, and we're gonna dive into the Judaizers' arguments, take them head on. And if you think about it, what would the Jews appeal to? What would the Jews appeal to? They would appeal to the Old Testament because that's the only Bible anybody has. So we call Old Testament. They would call it Scripture. And they say, look at Scripture. Look at what is said there. Look at Abraham. Who are the children of Abraham? Who are the covenant people? Okay, children of Abraham. Children of Abraham are marked by circumcision. Children of Abraham are marked by observing the Torah. Read the text. It's right there. Black and white. Or maybe it's not black and white. I don't know what color is papyrus. Okay, maybe not black and white. But there it is. Okay, read it. Okay. So Paul needs to deal with this question. Okay. However, our starting point of this passage is not with Paul's gospel or the Judaizers' interpretation or his refutal of the Judaizers. Our interpretation actually begins with our own theological tradition, the Reformation tradition, or some of us. Sorry, there are people who are not Reformation tradition here. That has, in some way, distorted this passage because they have used this passage in a different argument. Okay, the important word here is dikaiosune, or righteousness. The very typical traditional reading that I think we're familiar with, that righteousness refers to something about not transgressing against the rules. There are rules, and then if you don't break them, if you keep them, you are righteous. Okay? Dikaiosune. You are in a state of righteousness. And then the argument then is, if you look at, just as Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, the interpretation generally is, well, if you can't obey all the rules, and we can't, and because there's a lot of rules and you have to be perfect to obey them all. If you can't obey all the rules, well, God says it's okay, believe in Jesus, and he will fulfill the rules for you. Okay, so that's kind of a very loose summary of kind of the tradition that we grew up with. So righteousness, obey the rules, and faith is a way of saying, okay, I believe in Jesus, and Jesus will fulfill it and becomes our righteousness. He gives us the status of righteousness, even though we're not truly, we're not in our behavior righteous, but we have the status of righteousness based on Jesus. Okay. So that's pretty standard. Protestant understanding of this verse. Now, and they read this understanding straight back into Abraham. So Abraham had faith in God. He is therefore declared not guilty. His sins are forgiven, and he has right standing before God. Okay. We need to go back to this passage, Genesis 15. But before we do that, let's take a look at the word righteousness first. When we're talking about Genesis 15, dikaiosune, Paul is reading the Old Testament, so it's helpful to get the Old Testament understanding of the word. The word righteousness, dikaiosune, in the translate the Hebrew word tzedek and tzedakah. One shows 119 times, one shows 157 times in the Old Testament. If we do a study, you can't tell the difference between tzedek and tzedakah. Their usage range of meaning overlaps so much that we can't tell the difference. That happens a lot, actually. A lot of these, tzedek is a masculine noun, tzedakah is a feminine noun, and these paired nouns frequently have no distinction in meaning. It's like, I don't know why, it's just this. That's still a question in Hebrew grammar. There's no difference, so why? Why do they exist? Don't know. Okay.
No, briefly, the difference is in the vowels, right? So in the original Hebrew, isn't it just consonants? In tzedek and tzedakah?
Yes.
So is that a later addition of the vowels? So
what happens is
in the original Hebrew would it be the same consonants?
No, because the tzedakah, you notice the A with the little macron on top.
Yeah.
It's what we call a mater. It's Hebrew. Hebrew has a way of marking long vowel endings. So they mark it with a hey, with an H. So tzedakah's a consonant would be tzadhe, dalet, kof, hey, rather than talet, dov, just tzadhe, dalet, kof. Okay. So you actually see an extra consonant there, but the consonant is actually not a real consonant. It's actually marking long vowels.
To represent a long vowel.
That's with long vowels. Yes. So in Hebrew orthography or Hebrew writing, you will actually see. What do you call markers? Just using certain consonants, not as consonants, but as vowel markers.
And that's the long A as opposed
That's the long A at the end. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Good question though. Yeah, nice.
refers to
It's a feminine ending.
female.
It's a feminine ending. A long A is a feminine ending. So it's a good question. Very good observation. I don't think anybody's asked that before. Nice. Okay. Huh?
No, that's all.
I was like, oh, that's a good question. It's like, wait a minute, it looks the same. How do you know, right? It's a good question. The basic concept behind the two words is that, okay, so this is what the word means, tzedek and tzedakah. These two words mean. Basic concept is a situation that's as it should be. It's a rightful situation. So we have the word right put in there. It's just, everything's right. Thus, any activity, intention, or state that leads to this ultimate goal can be denoted by these two words. Now, if you think about God's tzedakah, God's righteousness is really his commitment or plan or intention to create order in his creation. Okay, so it is a state of making it is things being right. It is also his intention to make it right. It is also his action in making it right. Those will all be described as God's righteousness. Okay? And I think we can make that. God's righteousness, God's design for a right world, God's desire to faithfulness into making sure that he achieves it, and the actions that he undertakes to make it right. All part of what we mean by God's righteousness. Right? And we can get into more detail. We're not going to in here, but there's passages in which it's very interesting. If you look at the translation, it will translate about God's deliverance. Okay, there's certain passages you have God's righteousness and then God's deliverance. And if you look at deliverance, you look at the underlying Hebrew word, it's tzedakah. Because the word righteousness is actually God's action to make things right. But we can't translate that righteousness. It makes no sense in English to translate it that way. So we translate it as deliverance because it refers to actual actions to fix things in the world. Okay? So it's a very interesting. The word has a much broader range than our understanding of righteousness in English. So if you see this word, you just got to broaden it and broaden it. And in Hebrew, in Greek, dikaiosune, not only is a noun, but also dikaios means adjective, and then dikaiao, the verb. They're all. There's a verbal form, adjectival form, and noun form of this general understanding of this. So dikaiao would mean to make right. Okay, to make things right, and so we say, but we translate as justify, which is very narrow, right? It sounds very courtroom-like a definition to vindicate someone, courtroom-like. It narrows it. Whereas if you think of the broader understanding, to dikaiao, you can actually make right. I think the last time we always talk about make right the kitchen by cleaning it up. You know, you can justify your kitchen. Okay, or actually, some people translate not dikaiao, not justify, but rightify or rectify. Okay, ways to rectify doesn't exist, but they like to make that word because then you can connect it to righteousness. So they say rightify, righteousness, right, but some people say rectify. Like it gets more at the sense of this word than what we do justify. Okay. Any questions on this? Let's move on. So what does this passage mean in this? If you look at the word righteousness as being a state of being right, what does it mean? Do remember this is going to be a major question of the debate in between Judaizers and Paul. If you look at this passage, what are we focusing on? Just they don't believe God instead of reckoned him as righteousness, so you know that those who are from faith, pistis, these are the children of Abraham. Okay? The battle is over the identity of the children of Abraham. Okay? And the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify Gentiles from faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, "In you shall all the Gentiles be blessed." So then those who are from faith are blessed alongside faithful Abraham. So you can kind of see what's going on here, right? We have this. There's people who are from faith, okay, and Paul's arguing that the people who are from faith are the children of Abraham, and that not only that, but the calling of Abraham, the entire plan to call Abraham, is to bring the Gentiles in. Okay? To bring the Gentiles in. Let me see if I can see this a little more clearly. Okay. If you just read Genesis 12, I will build from you, your descendants, a nation. I will use the blessed nations. You would say, oh, well, the children of Abraham are Jews by lineage. Okay? By your bloodline. Right? It's about children. And if you look at the book Genesis, it's all about having children, right? I mean, Abraham, Sarah, was the big, long struggle over Sarah getting a baby. She's barren. She gets older. You can't have a baby. You gotta get Hagar. All that stuff is all about having babies. Okay? That's what Genesis is about. It's about having babies. And the same thing happens in Isaac and Rebecca. You know, she can't have babies. Every generation, people have problems with babies. Jews by lineage. And they have Gentiles out there. The Abraham promise, according to that one verse, should be this. But you know very well, once you read the rest of the Old Testament, that doesn't work. The storyline of the Jews, from Abraham onward to Moses onward, you very quickly find out they're Jews who don't believe God, who reject God, have no faith in God. And then you find out that they're Gentiles who do. Right? So the idea of conversion pops in. Right? So you have Gentile converts can enter into the Jewish line, and there are people who are in the Jewish lineage who are out. Okay? So people like Ruth, people like Rahab, enter into the community and become part of the Jewish community, and there are people who are kicked out. And if you look at the storyline further and further on, the idea of the remnant theology shows up in the Old Testament. There's only a small portion okay, of Torah-keeping Jews who are truly the covenant people of God. The rest are not. Okay. So if by the time of the first century, Jewish mindset would say, no, the people of God is not by lineage. Because back then, you got Jews who were like trying to undo their circumcision. Yeah, seriously. I don't know how you do it, but they try to undo it because they want to mix in, they want to Hellenize. They want to mix in with the Greeks. The Greeks have the power, Greeks have the influence. Being Jewish is kind of a pain. And when you go to the gymnasium in which all the men are naked, being circumcised is a definitely negative. Okay, you look wrong, you look off, you look like you belong there. You don't belong. So there's all kinds of pressure to Hellenize. So for the Jewish, there's a kind of a cultural reaction against that. He says, no, we're not Greek, we're not Roman, we're Jews, and we're going to keep the Torah and draw the line very clearly about who we are. And people who are willing to convert are part of this larger circle. So the first one is up there is Genesis 12, and this passage would be the first century Jews. Okay. I don't know how many converts there were. I mean, this is too big by size. I need to increase the size to be able to pop the word in there. Okay, sorry. It's a very small number. Okay. And then Christians, early Christians, especially the people from Jerusalem church, or you're talking about the circumcision party, James leading this particular group, James, the brother of Jesus, what you call Messianic Jews. And they're actually Christians as well, Jewish Christians as well, who argue that what it means is really that Jews who are part of this Torah-keeping group, they believe that Jesus is the Messiah. So we're part of this group as well. Okay? So here's the problem. Here's Paul's church in Galatia, and they're Christians, but they're outside of the Torah-keeping section. Okay? So the battle is over, okay, who are the children of Abraham? What are children of Abraham defined by? Okay. Now, if you think, here's a major problem with the Jewish and Judaizers' argument. And I think Paul's going to drive a Mack truck through it. And they have this problem. It's pretty obvious. You can think about it for a moment. You think, wait a minute. Who are the children of Abraham? Oh, it was his descendants. Well, that's not right. It's actually Torah-keeping Jews. Yeah, but there was no Torah at the time of Abraham. Right? The Mosaic covenant has not been given yet. How could that work? That's a major problem. But yet they want to limit the identity of Abraham's descendants and the blessing thereof and the covenant established thereof to this group. So how do they actually do this? Well, the Jewish interpreters came up with a solution. That is, Abraham actually kept the Torah. This is Sarah, chapter 44, 1921. This, I think, is in the Apocrypha. Yes. Abraham was the great father of a multitude of nations, and no one has been found like him in glory. He kept the law, the Torah of the Most High. How did he do that? And was taken into covenant with him. He established a covenant in his flesh, and he was tested, he was found faithful. Therefore the Lord assured him by an oath that the nations would be blessed through his posterity, and they would multiply him like the dust of the earth, and exalt his posterity like the stars, and cause him to inherit from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. Okay, you're going to be the whole world is going to be your inheritance. How did they get this idea that Abraham kept the law of the Most High? How did they get that? Where did this come from? Okay, how could this possibly work? First Maccabees. And here's you get a little more explanation of how is that possible. Was not Abraham found faithful when tested? By the way, faith, faithful, belief, same understanding, Greek word pisteo, when tested, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Okay. But in the passage was that Genesis 15, Abraham believed and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Here they're talking about he was tested and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. What are they talking about? Now let's get to the New Testament. This is James. Okay? This is James, brother of Jesus. This is the head of the circumcision party. Okay? Read it that was a little weird, isn't it? Was not Abraham our father justified or made right with God by works when he offered his son Isaac upon the altar? Oh, that's what they're talking about. Now, James is drawing on Jewish tradition, interpretive tradition. Okay, you see that faith. You see that same tradition as Maccabees, the same tradition as Sarah. you see that faith was active along his works, with his works, and faith was completed by works. And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, Abraham believed God and was reckoned to him as righteousness. Okay? And he was called a friend of God. You see that a man is justified by works and not by faith. You see what interesting passage they do. This is Genesis 15. What happens in the offering of the son is Genesis 22. 7 chapters later. So how did the Jews read this? They said, Abraham fulfilled the Torah in a, I guess, conceptual sense, which Torah was not really given yet, but in a kind of ideal way by offering his son for a sacrifice. And in doing so, God, knowing that's going to happen, reckoned him as righteous. Bounces back to Genesis 15. You see how they do this verse. Okay. Any question on that? James is drawing on Jewish interpretation from. If you look at Sarah, is the same thing, right? He kept all the covenant, was taking the covenant with him when he was tested and was found faithful. The covenant established was in Genesis 15 and 17. They reverse the order and they all think, no. The basis of the covenant was his faithfulness and the testing of sacrifice of Isaac. This is a common first century Jewish understanding of what's going on with Abraham. That's how you justify saying, well, to be children of Abraham, you need to keep the Torah, because Abraham did it. Go ahead.
And why is sacrificing Isaac keeping the Torah?
Well, they would understand that in some way, well, first of all, the sacrifice, ceremonial, but then it's some way of a test, right? It's kind of a, so there is a behavioral component to this, and then you would say, well, the testing of Isaac is really now in our first century circumcision through law and Sabbath keeping. There's a sacrifice involved. in a cost to ourselves. We're in a Hellenistic world, dominated by the Romans, and they all have their Greek philosophies, and they think poorly of us. They think Jews are a bunch of people who believe in weird superstitions.
Another way of looking at it is, well, Abraham kept the Torah because he obeyed the law that God gave him. Now he has given us much more law, so we have to keep those laws as well.
Okay, that's another way of looking at that. Yeah, but for somehow they saw the sacrifice of Torah as sacrifice of Isaac as a fulfillment of the Torah in some way, which so you see the testing, and he says he kept the law of the Most High. Those are identical things, and that allows them to say children of Abraham are defined by people who keep the Torah. They're the people who actually are part of this. Okay, and James actually does the same thing. Actually, he's really explicit about it. He says it fulfills the Scripture. By later on doing the things, doing the sacrifice, he completes this reckoning as righteousness that serves as the foundation for the covenant with Abraham. Okay. That's their move. Interesting move. And if you want to think about this, how you can make this work, how you can see Abraham believe God as being somehow related to the sacrifice of Isaac. Well, it's the same Greek word, root. Pistis, faith, is the same thing as faithfulness. And to believe, pisteuo, is the same root. So if you want to read this as being, well, Abraham was faithful to God. He believed God, he was faithful to God. And God reckoned it to him as righteousness. You can kind of make that move fairly easily in Greek. In English, it's much harder. Because we have faithful and believe, and they don't sound anything like each other. But if they all sound the same, to faith on God, to be faithful to God, become fairly similar. So
I need to comment that. So I don't agree with James, but it seems like he can make that argument about the belief of Abraham and then the action.
Yeah.
And then make the parallel, belief in Jesus and then the action, which is what he's saying. He's saying, yeah, we have Jesus, we believe in him, and then we do the actions. Like it fits.
Yeah.
I don't agree with it. I don't think Paul agrees with it either.
No, Paul's going to destroy this argument. But
Matt Truck.
Yeah. But you see how they do it. They have to do this. To define children of Abraham by Torah keeping, they have to say that Abraham was a Torah keeper. But that's a problem because there's no Torah. Okay. So let's come over here. Let's come back to Paul's argument now. So here's the thing. This verse that argument that we were just presented with is likely something that Judaizers would have presented to the Galatians. Now, how do we know that? We're guessing. Okay, but by the prevalence of it in Sirach and Maccabees and James, this is a normal move for them. Okay, this would be likely an argument. So Paul is probably picking up one of their lines and says, okay, just as Abraham believed God is his righteousness, you know those who are from faith, these are the children of Abraham. Okay, he's making a different argument here. First of all, hang on a second, what's going on here? There we go. Show up. We need to look at Genesis 15 in more detail. Okay, Paul's accessing Genesis 15. By the way, there are people who always there's different theories of thought when New Testament writers like Paul quote the Old Testament. Okay, there are people who think that they prove text. So Paul's talking about faith, belief, and justification. He found some verse in the Old Testament, pulls it right out. Okay, I find that highly unlikely. Okay, the big issue here is children of Abraham. Abraham is the big issue. And he's going to pull this passage, and he's going to assume that the people there understands this passage. Okay, Paul, when he's quoting entire segments. Okay, just a slight aside. When Jesus goes up there and says, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," why, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's not just saying, "Oh, I'm forsaken by God." He's quoting Psalm 22, which is a messianic psalm, which begins with the suffering of the king figure and the rejection of the king figure, almost the death of the king figure, and then his triumph. Okay? So you think, is that a cry of despair? Well, yes, if you just read one line. If you read him as saying, "Oh, Jesus is quoting Psalm 22," it's a triumphant cry at the end. This may be what's happening to me now, but the kingship will rise. The Messiah will rise again. Read Psalm 22. Read the whole thing. If he's quoting the whole thing, that changes what that passage means. Big time. Okay? It's a triumphant cry. Okay? Just check it out. Same thing here. He's not quoting one verse. He's quoting the whole section, the entire piece, the entire pericope, and it changes how you read the passage. Okay. So after these things, the word of the Lord Yahweh came to Abraham in a vision. "Fear not, Abram. I'm your shield. Your reward shall be very great." But Abraham said, "Oh Lord God, what wilt thou give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus." And Abram said, "Behold, you give me no offspring, and a slave born in my house will be my heir." And behold, the word of Yahweh came to him, "This man shall not be your heir, your own son shall be your heir." And he brought him outside and said, "Look toward heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them." Then he said to him, "So shall your descendants be." And he believed Yahweh, and he reckoned to him as righteousness. So there's your phrase right there that Paul's keeping. Okay. What's going on? God promised Abraham, "From your descendants come a nation." No kids. No kids, right? So he has some guy named Eliezer, and he's going to inherit everything. And Abraham said, "Okay, so what's going on?" God says, "I will give it to you," and Abraham believed it. Okay. So the belief here cannot be a reference to faithfulness later in the sacrifice, right? It has to be. Belief in this situation means to trust in God's promises, right? This belief does not believe in the existence of Yahweh. We're well past that now. Okay, it's not to believe in the existence of Yahweh, but to believe in God, in God's promises, and then to live your life structured by these promises. Okay, to live as though that those promises are entirely true and live that way. Now, if you take a look at this. God reckoned it, or thought of it, as the Kaiosune, or actually no, Tzedek, okay, Tzedekah. He considered this a right thing. Not that he obeys some rules, not that he has a right status before God. He considered this right. This is the right kind of relationship between humans and God. Okay. If you think about Adam and Eve, they don't do tzedakah because they don't believe God's promise. God's promise says, that tree is bad for you, you eat it, you will die. Eve said, nah. Okay? She did not believe, and Adam ate along with it. They did not believe God's promises. And here we have a human being who said, God promises this, I'm going to buy into it. I'm going to believe and live my life as though this is true. This promise is going to happen. And God says, that's it. That's the basis of covenant relationship between God and humanity. Indeed, if you look at what happened next, what happens next in Genesis 15 is the great passage of the establishment of the Abrahamic covenant. Okay? Once this happened, once it declared, Abraham believed, and God says, that's just right. That's it. Let's do the covenant. God, he has fulfilled the foundational requirement for covenant. Okay? So, which is why this passage is so critical in Genesis. You got into Genesis 15. So, Abraham believes that God is going to... No, remember that believing God's going to give a son, that's a little too narrow. Okay? He believes God's going to give him children, descendants, through which God's going to establish his rule and make the world right. That's the entirety of the Abrahamic covenant. See, if you believe that, then Abraham's faith is the Christian faith. Right? That God is going to establish and reestablish his reign and make the world right via the descendant of Abraham. And we all believe that. So Paul's really arguing is, look, Abraham's faith is this posture of faith defines the people who are of faith. And they are the true children of Abraham. Everybody who shares that faith is a child of Abraham. Okay? So if we go back to the passage, just as Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteous, so you know that those who are of faith, those who are born from, because it's ek is from exit, the Greek preposition, who are out of faith, who are poor, who are defined from faith. These are the children of Abraham. And the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles from faith, preached the gospel of Abraham to Abraham, saying, "In you shall all the Gentiles be blessed." That those who are from faith are blessed along with faithful Abraham. Two types of people will be with Abraham: those who are from faith, and also the whole point of calling Abraham, it's not merely for Abraham's children, is to bring in the Gentiles. Okay? So I'm going to go recall that passage out of 12 and out of 15, and it says, look, it's really about Gentiles all along. Okay. Any questions on this? Are we good? Okay, we're good. Okay, so it's not about status, it's about the right posture of a person in covenant with God. Okay? Believe God's promises. What is God's promise? He is going to make the world right. His righteous, he is committed to making the world right. And he's going to do it through a descendant of Abraham, and which we all believe to be Jesus. And he's going to get to that later. The whole seed argument is going to come right into this thing. Okay? Which means, if you think about this, this bypasses the entire argument about the sacrifice of Isaac. Right? If Abraham's children is defined by faith, how does Torah keeping fit into this? Okay?
Well, if you're not Jewish and not following the Torah, you're not being faithful.
Well, yeah, but Abraham didn't have any Torah. We're going to jump right. This is exactly the next passage that's going to happen. Down here it's really small, isn't it? Sorry, I needed to show you the big picture a bit. Sorry, and we're coming to a rather difficult passage. Okay, sorry. I was like, yeah, it is. Okay, yeah, it's a tough passage. So I want to give you a little bit of context to work my way outside Torah did. But I want you to understand the movement, right? So if we're defining Abraham, right here, verse 6, if we define Abraham as the children of Abraham as people who are out of faith, then what about the Torah? That's obviously the next question, right? And that shows up right there from verse 10. Right? So, but however, if you look at the context, the bigger issue is actually the spirit. Okay?
Sure.
Yes?
I have a question.
Sure.
Well, it seems to me that Abraham's faith
Mhm.
culminated when he sacrificed Isaac. And that's when his name was changed from
Yes.
Abraham to Abraham,
Yes.
meaning his father.
Yes. I would say his sacrifice of Isaac is a strong illustration of his faith in God's promises.
Or is that an accomplishment of his faith, actually?
Well, then I would say James would argue that. Paul would not. Right? James would say, yeah, see, for him to believe God, really, how do we know he believed God? No. His true belief is illustrated by his believing that if I can sacrifice Isaac, God is still going to make it happen. By taking away the very thing that God has promised, my own son, and God is still going to accomplish this promise. We don't know how he's going to do it. And the Jewish commentators argue that somehow Abraham believed that God is going to resurrect Isaac. That he was going to kill him and God's going to resurrect him. And that's not in Genesis text, but that's certainly in the Jewish interpreter's mind says, yeah, that must be what Abraham was thinking.
In fact, isn't there another passage in the New Testament that mentions that precisely?
Yeah. I think that's in Hebrews, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, Hebrews. So there's New Testament, there's Jewish commentators talk about, this is the tradition to understand by Abraham. God's going to resurrect Isaac. That's how he's going to carry through with it. His faith in God's promise is so strong that he will kill his own son with the expectation that God will resurrect him. Okay. No, so you're right. You can make that argument, and that's exactly what James does. And he says that whole line about reckoning as righteousness, reckoning as right, that is a proleptic, future-oriented move. Okay? And if you understand the sacrifice of Isaac as somehow a Torah-keeping act, then you can see how they make that move. And Paul's going to say, nah, let's not go there. Okay? Because the whole point is not about Torah-keeping. The whole point is to have faith that God is going to fix the world. And anybody who believes that and live that way, they're in. Torah has nothing to do with this. Okay? In fact, we're going to see that there's a real problem with the Torah coming up. Okay. But what I want to do is, by showing you this, just show you that we already looked at these passages, more than half of these passages. We're talking about the Spirit up there, receiving the Spirit, and the whole section ends with, we might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. Okay. What he's getting at is this entire passage is about the Holy Spirit, and they're receiving the Spirit, and the question is, how does it happen? Well, it's a strange question to ask, given that they've already received it. Okay. So what we're really dealing with is from experience, we know, your experience, Galatians' experience, you receive the Spirit through hearing with faith. And now what we need is the gospel and a scriptural explanation that makes sense of that experience. Okay? Because somebody's telling you, yeah, you got the Spirit, but now you can get circumcised. And I'm going to say, no. Here's a way of understanding Scripture that allows you to explain your actual experience. So that you don't need to go around and do something that you already got the Spirit. Right? So that's what this passage is going. I want to show you the shape of the passage. Okay? So it begins with Abraham and belief, and then we're going to come to Torah right here. Okay? And that's an interesting passage, and it's also a very difficult passage. Okay, so we kind of know where we're going. The second thing to note about this, and then it's going to get color-coded pretty crazily. You guys see this? I'm having fun reading it. Can you guys read this? Yes. The colors. Okay, so you have the Spirit, right? We saw that, the green colors. And what you also note is the contrast between with faith, from faith, and also works of the Torah, and those from the works of the Torah. There really is two types of ways. So as mentioned earlier, there's two ways to access the Spirit. That idea continues on. It doesn't change. It's still, those who are from faith, those who are from faith, and those who are from works of the Torah. And there's two arguments for how you get the Spirit of God. And we'll cover the Spirit last week of this session. But that's the goal. How are you going to get there? Okay. And this passage is trying to show you that from faith, you already got it from hearing originally. And second, from faith, it defines people of Abraham. And that from the works of the Torah actually does not get you the Spirit, but gets you a curse. Okay, you see that? So people who are going to go out of the works of the Torah are actually cursed. How do we know that? Okay. Okay.
Briefly, Spirit, Paraclete.
Here's pneuma. Pneuma. Paraclete is a Johannine term. The Gospel of John.
Okay.
And they usually translate as counselor, or advocate or counselor. Yeah. So here's
the word is
pneuma, or like pneumatic, air, breath,
which is like
wind,
breath. Okay.
breath, air, breath,
Which is
wind.
what's the Hebrew?
Ruach.
Okay, that's it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So probably familiar terms. Just as okay, so we're diving into the passage now that we saw earlier. Just as Abraham believed God, it was where have we already got this? You shall okay. Let me jump down. Verse 10. So we ended with, so then those who are from faith are blessed along with faith for Abraham. Verse 10. For as many as those who are from the works of the Torah, they're under a curse. For it is written, cursed be everyone who does not abide by all things written in the books of the Torah and do them. Because it is evident that no one is justified before God by the Torah, for the righteous will live from faith. But the Torah is not from faith, for he who does them shall live by them. The Messiah redeemed us from the curse of the Torah, having become a curse for us. For it is written, cursed be everyone who hangs on a tree, in order that the blessing of Abraham might come upon the Gentiles in King Jesus, in order that we might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. Okay? So the whole point is still talking about Abraham, is still talking about the Spirit. Those are the two things we're getting at. On what terms do you become children of Abraham? On what terms do you receive the Spirit? We also need to understand this really strange passage. Okay. So let's try that. Figure this part out. And it's not moving. There we go. Curse. People who try to access Abraham and being a children of Abraham try to access the Spirit via the works of the Torah, the defining features of Torah, Sabbath, Sabbath keeping, circumcision, food laws. They're under the power of a curse. Okay, whereas from the faith people are blessed. Right? They're blessed. They're blessed along with faithful Abraham. So we have blessing, curse, contrast. Okay. Now, why does Paul say they're cursed? Okay. Well, the quote he comes out of brings up, "Cursed be everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the Torah and do them," comes out of Deuteronomy 27:26. It's the last verse of the chapter. You have that in front of you. I'm not going to read the whole thing. This is the great covenant affirmation scene in Deuteronomy, in which there are on two sides of this valley, and you have one side crying out the curse, and the people saying "Amen" back and forth. Okay, they're saying yes, we will agree with this, and there's blessings that you're going to receive if you follow those, and there's curses you will receive if you do this. So we have this back and forth, and the word curse in it's arur in Hebrew is the opposite of blessing, whereas to bless in the Old Testament means to confer fertility, life, it's a quality of life, appetite, progeny. It's a vigorous life. Cursing is the opposite. It's a consignment toward death. It's a shrinkage away of life. It's shriveling up of life. Okay, so we have this curses and blessings of the covenant in the Mosaic covenant. And it ends with this line that says, "Cursed be he who does not conform to the words of this law, this Torah, by doing them." And all the people said, "Amen." Okay. Wow. Okay, kind of scary, isn't it? You're like, yes, we're going to get cursed if we don't do this. Thanks. Yeah. There's a blessing part we didn't quote. Okay. So that's what curses mean in general in the Old Testament. But there's a very specific curse in the Torah, in Deuteronomy. So you see, it starts with 27 about curses, then 28. Moses starts talking to them about what's going to happen to them. And it's a really interesting thing. He says, you're not going to be able to keep this. And the curse of the Torah is going to be very specific. Yahweh will bring you and your king, whom you set over you, to a nation that neither you nor your fathers have known, and there you shall serve other gods. Of wood and stone, and you shall become a horror, a proverb, and a byword among all the peoples, where the Yahweh will lead you away. You're going to be this people in all over the world, and people are going to go, "Oh, look at them! Wow, that's a sad group of people." Okay. 47-52. Because you did not serve Yahweh your God with joyfulness and gladness of heart by reason of the abundance of all things. Therefore you shall serve your enemies, whom Yahweh will send against you in hunger and thirst, in nakedness and in want of all things. And he will put a yoke of iron upon your neck until he has destroyed you. Yahweh will bring a nation against you from afar, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flies, a nation whose language you do not understand, a nation of stern countenance, who shall not regard the person of the old, or show favor to the young, and shall eat the offspring of your cattle and the fruit of your ground until you are destroyed. Who also shall not leave you grain, wine, or oil, the increase of your cattle or the young of your flock, until they have caused you to perish. They shall besiege you in all your towns until your high and fortified walls in which you trusted come down throughout all your land, and they shall besiege you in all your towns throughout all your land, which Yahweh your God has given you. So after this blessing and curses section, we suddenly realize the curse that Deuteronomy is talking about is really a community national curse. Okay? It's about what? It's about exile. Okay? That understanding will explain this passage. You're going to go, oh, that makes a whole lot of sense. Watch what happens. Actually, there's more. Wow, I put a lot in here. Maybe I can stop reading this one. Now this is 20 I'm just letting you know 28 is huge. Okay? 28 is huge about defining exactly what a curse is. Okay? Right after the 27, if you just look at the whole passage, there's more here about what's going to happen to you. No rest for you, no homeland, blah, blah, blah. It's going to go on and on and on, okay? And you shall offer yourselves for sale to your enemies as male and female slaves, but no man will buy you. Nobody will buy you even. Okay. So this is apparently the place, the valley, in which half of them is shouted on one side, half of them shouted on the other side. Okay, so some people yell the blessings, some people yell the curses. Okay. So let's read this passage based on that understanding. Okay. Everyone who who are from out of the works of the Torah, and that's not just the Judaizers, also the Jews, are under a curse. Why? Because cursed be everyone who does not abide by all of these things written in the book of the Torah and do them. What's the curse? Let me read the next line. Because it is evident no one is justified before God by the Torah, for the righteous will live from faith. Let's skip that line for now. That's another quote from Habakkuk. It is evident that no one is justified before God by the Torah. Why is it evident? Okay, let me show what justify means. It is clear, it's evident, everybody can see this, that no one is made right. The situation is not made right before God by the Torah. Why? Why is it so darn evident?
Because right after...
Huh?
No one obeys them completely.
No one's supposed to be, okay, well no, but if you look at this passage, because everyone is under a curse.
Well, because right when they give the law, right there, they say that it's not gonna, that the people aren't gonna keep it and they're gonna be cursed.
Yeah.
Does it mean that because the Jews are oppressed by the Romans, that it is a sign of the curse?
Yes, exactly. It is evident the Torah doesn't work because look at the Jews. They're under the curse. What curse is that? Babylon went over, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans, they are destroyed. They are separated all over the world. The curse of the Torah is upon them. Everyone who are from the works of Torah are under a curse.
In other words,
Huh?
the Jews are finding mechanisms to survive and
Yes.
thrive, rather than the mechanisms that was given to them.
The Torah doesn't do them any good. The Torah has not done them any good. It's evident. It's clear-cut as to anybody. Why would you want to be under the Torah if this is what the Torah has done? You want to be Jewish? Look at them. It's horrible.
Isn't there a passage after those curses saying, well, I don't remember, but isn't it saying something to the effect of, but if you obey God, then these things are going to be great?
In Deuteronomy?
I thought there was, maybe not.
I don't think so. There's something there about the person they're gonna. There's a kind of a messianic thing going on there. Okay, yeah, there is, which we're not going to get to in Galatians, but there's something in there about that. But Paul's accessing this very idea. Look, being marked by the Torah, being of the works of the Torah people, the Jews and the Judaizers, they're all part of that. Being a children of Abraham means Torah keeping. How's that working out for you? Okay? How's that working out for you? You're under the curse of the Torah. Okay? Deuteronomy curse, you guys invoked it upon yourself, and it's still going on. Chapter 20, it defined it for you. There it is. And it's happening right before your eyes. It is evident. They're under a curse, and it is evident that you can't. They're not. If they're cursed, they're not right before God. Things are not in a good situation. So obviously, Torah has not justified them at all. They've done nothing for them.
But if you were telling that to a Jewish person,
Yeah.
you know, the devout Jewish person, they would say, well, we need to work harder to follow the laws of the Torah. And that's why you Christians
Yeah.
should be doing.
Right, that's what they would say.
Right.
And Paul would say, why would you, if you started off with already getting the Spirit, if you already got the goods, why would you go backwards? If the whole goal is to receive the promise of the Spirit through faith,
Right.
if that's the goal, to get the Spirit, why would you go backwards and go through a mechanism that's brought no one any good? Right? It just brought you nothing but curse. Does that make sense? About what this section about the curse is. All right. This is another one of those things where if you just quote the verse directly, if you just read the verse without looking at it as a quote, you look at it and think, oh, but Paul is talking about something like that people believe somehow that you must perform every single line in the Torah. It's something that's about personal ethical behavior, right? But what he's really getting at is, I think what he's getting at is, they're getting at the curse of the people, of the Jewish people. Okay. The curse of the Torah, curse of Deuteronomy. Okay. And then, same thing in verse 11, because it is evident that no one is justified before God by the Torah, for the righteous will live by faith. Okay. Torah is not going to make anything right. The solution has to come from God, so the righteous will live out of faith in God, who is going to make things right. Okay, I'm reading that passage. I'm telling you how I'm going to read that passage. And because that's how you're supposed to read the passage out of Habakkuk. Let's look at Habakkuk real quick. Okay, so my interpretation is, no one's going to be justified by doing the Torah, but the right ones will live by faith in God, who will make things right, which is exactly what Abraham does, right? The righteous is defined by having faith in God's ability to fix things. And this is Habakkuk. If you have a Bible with you, you can scan through this. I'm just going to quote the beginning of chapter 2, but I'm going to give you a quick summary. Chapter 1 through 4, Habakkuk is talking about, oh, Yahweh, why the injustice? Presumably in Israel, there's like a lot of injustice going on. He's really upset. This is back in the Old Testament, time before the exile, and he's like, why, oh, why? This is all happening, and Yahweh's response, my punishment is coming via the Chaldeans, which are Babylonians, another way for Babylonians. Habakkuk 1, 5 through 11, and the Habakkuk's response is, wait a minute, the Chaldeans are worse than us. Okay, we're bad, yes. God says we need to be punished via the Babylonians. And wait a minute, the Babylonians are worse. They're idolaters. They're worse than bloodthirsty people. How can you use them to punish us? That's not right. Okay, so that's pretty much chapter 1 of Habakkuk. If you get a chance to read it, and then we jump to 2 verse 1 through 4. So Habakkuk says, I'm going to go and wait for God to answer me. I will take my stand to watch and station myself on the tower and look forth to see what He will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint. And Yahweh answered me. Write the vision, make it plain upon tablets, so he may run who reads it. For still the vision awaits its time, it hastens to the end. It will not lie. It's coming. It's coming. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. Behold, he whose soul is not upright in him shall fail, but the righteous shall live by his faith. The story, the movement of this passage says, look, Chaldeans are going to come and destroy you. That's not right, that's not fair, but God's going to make things right again. Okay? Just wait for it. Patience. However, the soul who is not upright, he'll fail. He'll give up. But the righteous shall live by his faith. Faith in what? His faith in God's commitment to make things right. Right? That's the interpretation of this passage of Habakkuk. That fits the context. Which, when Paul cites it, that's what he's getting at. Right? Evident, no one will be justified by the Torah. The Torah will not fix anything. But the righteous person is the person who believes in God's promise to fix things, which is what Abraham does, and which is what every Christian does. Okay? Not based on anything about Torah or Torah keeping. Verse 12, but the Torah is not from faith, because he who does them shall live by them. Quote out of, let's see now, Leviticus 18:5, which he uses to prove that the Torah is not about faith. It's about doing. Right? So Torah is not from faith, because in 18:5 it says, he who does them shall live by them. He who does them, if you do the Torah, you live by them. You don't live out of faith. You live by the things you do, by the behavior. Therefore, Torah is not a faith thing. Torah is not a faith thing. Therefore, Torah keeping is not going to work. It's just going to be cursed. It's just going to invoke the curse of Jews upon you, the curse of the Torah, of Deuteronomy on you, and so forth. Any questions? Sure.
Then when it was referred to in Genesis about Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, it kind of refers to faith rather than Torah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So actually it corresponds to faith.
He's going to argue that has nothing to do with Torah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing. I think
so
Paul,
they're talking about two things actually when they refer to Torah.
The Jewish and Judaizers the Jews and Judaizers are going to argue that sacrifice of Isaac is somehow a kind of Torah keeping, which Paul rejects.
Which came from faith.
Okay, so you can say it works just fine. It's actually faith, right? But for them, it's some kind of Torah keeping, because and by having that, they allows them to define all children of Abraham as Torah keepers. They have to make that move. If you don't, then you become Christians.
I guess
right?
like, the way to reconcile them is they have different interpretations of Torah.
Well, if you think about it,
One is like in the spirit.
Before Paul shows up, before Christians showed up, if you're a Jew, if you're confronted with the problem of remnant theology, if you're confronted with the problem that many descendants of Abraham are not actually Yahweh worshippers. So you have a huge problem on your hands. Who is the true covenant people? Okay. You have people who don't believe. Well, okay, are you still Jewish? And for them, they say, you know what? No. We need to define this more clearly, because there are clearly people out there who are not Yahweh worshippers, but who are descendants of Abraham. So we need to come up with a way to make this work. Oh, we have the Torah, but Torah's from Moses. How do we attach that to Abraham?
It almost sounds like they're taking the scripture and adapt it for their own needs.
Yes,
Well,
but don't we all?
No, but Paul is arguing that.
Paul is arguing, no, you got this wrong. But Paul used to argue that way. He was a Pharisee. But see, he's able to argue this way because of Christ. By Christ, it opens up a new way. If you didn't have Christ, all you had was the Torah. Okay? Then I think the Jews' arguments kind of make sense. Okay? They had to make it work. But when a new path outside the Torah, but the prophet of the Torah testified to it, a new way of righteousness and vindication through faith in Jesus showed up. Paul says, I'll give you this one. I'll take this one. And by the way, the way you did it originally makes no sense. That just makes no sense. It's inconsistent. It's illogical. Abraham did not have the Torah. So how can anybody be a children of Abraham? How can that be defined by Torah keeping? Okay.
I'm just, maybe just to strict this more explicit, I thought like in Maccabees and James, the Torah actually meant to be really the faith in God, and that's really the utmost essence of Torah.
Yeah.
But then later on, Torah became really the law and the sort of the ritualistic performance and.
Well, I think they wouldn't want to. The thing, like I said, they equated them somehow. For us, we can draw the lines more clearly because we have an alternative. For them, I don't think they had an alternative. Now, if you're a Jew, and we're the children of Abraham, you just have to connect those two things. Abraham was a Torah keeper, right? And however you go about doing it, and you can say, yeah, okay, there's a change in the understanding of Torah, a progression, and I think that's right. But for them, the connection has to be made.
And then, so why is the curse? Why does Jesus have to redeem us from the curse?
Mm-hmm.
Because if faith came before Torah, then why can't we just why can't we just short circuit the Torah and go to faith? He's basically saying that faith was first.
Yeah.
So we should buy into faith.
Yeah.
So why does Jesus need to deal with the curse?
Okay. This is a really good question. Take a look at this passage. It's right here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're looking at this passage right now. Okay. So, the Messiah redeemed us from the curse of the Torah, having become a curse for us. For it is written, cursed will be everyone who hangs on a tree, in order that the blessing of Abraham might come upon the Gentiles in King Jesus, in order that we might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. Okay. The blessing is going to come through the Abrahamic covenant community. Okay? Now, the covenant community began its life among the Jews. Okay? It's going to continue through there. You're talking about a complete bypass.
Okay.
Okay. So the Messiah needs in some way to redeem, take on the curse in some way, so that you can create this new seed of Abraham to begin. And actually, he's going to talk about seed of Abraham, not today, but later on. Okay. So let me try and make this make sense first. Okay, about the curse of the beyond the tree. Let me take on that first. Okay. Deuteronomy 21:22, and I think this is what he's citing. The precise quotation is unclear. We can't really find that in the Old Testament. So when Paul sometimes cites, we're a little worried. Curse of anyone who hangs on a tree is actually not in the Old Testament. But we have Deuteronomy 21:22. If a man has committed a crime punishable by death, he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree. And verse 23, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but you shall bury him the same day, for a hanged man is accursed by God. Okay, it's there, but it's a bit of a paraphrase, I guess. And you shall not defile your land, which the Yahweh your God gives you for inheritance. So that's Deuteronomy 21:22. So if he commits a crime, hang him on a tree, and the hanged man is accursed by God. That's a sign of God's curse upon him. Okay, that's kind of. It's not a direct quote. It's close. Okay, so you're absolutely right. Somehow, remember the Jews, the people who are under the curse of the Torah, they are they're under this thing, and Jesus is going to go and become a curse for them. Now here's the us part that's really interesting. Is us talking about Jews? Is he talking about Paul? Or is he talking about the Gentiles? Okay?
It seems like it's a really consistent to say that it refers to the Gentiles, because then...
Yeah, but they're not under the curse in the first place.
Yeah.
But here's what's interesting about this. If you look at the ending, it seems he's saying it's for the Gentiles. Why? Because by taking on the curse, it allows for the possibility that the blessing of Abraham may come on the Gentiles in King Jesus, in order that we might receive the promise of Spirit through faith. So if you put it this way, okay, technically, yeah, you don't have the curse on you. If you're a Gentile, you don't have the curse on you. But if you want to receive the blessing of Abraham that's full, accessible, then Jesus had to go under and redeem and become the curse. So in a sense, then he did it for the Gentiles, right? So in a sense, we're all. So if you put it this way, Jews, by failing their original mission. Remember, the original mission is to bless the Gentiles. That's what was right up there. Gentiles are supposed to be blessed through Abraham. How's that project going? Okay. Not only do they not bless the Gentiles, they themselves are under a curse. Now, if you say, okay, they're under a curse, are the Gentiles under the curse? Yeah. Because the Jews have failed. Because they're under a curse, the Gentiles, in consequence, are not getting blessed because of their failure. So in a sense, then, the whole world is under the curse of Deuteronomy. The Jews' failure and Jews' exile and Jews' inability to be the light of the world, to be the one in which other people see and go, that's God, their failure affects everybody.
Maybe
so we're under the curse.
Of the Garden of Eden.
Yes, but he's talking about the curse of the Torah, right? The Messiah redeemed us from the curse of the Torah. So the curse here would be most likely the quote up there on their curse, which curse everyone does. He's talking about the curse in Deuteronomy, at least within this passage. But I think you're right. The whole world is under the curse of Adam and Eve, and I think that's the prior one, in which. So you're right. I think you're right. Theologically speaking, I think Paul has that in his mind. In this passage, he's talking about this, but overall, I think that's part of the theological framework.
Okay, so the view was that Israel was supposed to be a nation from whom else?
In you shall all the Gentiles be blessed. Yep. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, so Israel was, the purpose of Israel was to be the redemption of the world.
Yes. And if they fail, the whole world gets it. The whole world is cursed indirectly. They have the explicit curse upon them of exile and diaspora. The rest of you, we're under the curse anyway. And so Christ, in a sense, he has to go through and take on the Israel's curse, right? So as to open it up. Now Israel's functioning again. Okay, Israel is now we have the Israel, the Jewish nation that's fallen apart under curse, and then we have through it comes out is Jesus, a new Israel that's now properly functioning, that opens up the blessing to the whole world. So in a sense then, for Jesus to be the new Israel, he has to take on the curse that's affected Israel. Okay. If you want to think about those lines, then what you're really kind of getting at is kind of what Paul here is a little, he talks about new Israel language, but if you look at gospel writers, John, who says, Jesus says in John, destroy this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days. He's already accessing temple language. I am the temple. My crucifixion is the destruction of the temple by Gentiles. Right? His crucifixion is kind of a Babylonian exile revisited. And the Babylonian destruction of the temple revisited. Does that make sense? So there's elements of that already showing up in the gospel, in Jesus' own speech about who he is and how he functions in New Israel, in naming the 12 disciples, 12 tribes of Israel, 40 days in the wilderness. There's these description of him as kind of a new Israel, and his crucifixion then is a way of taking on the punishment, the failure of Israel, so that now he becomes the new foundation by which he's now doing what Israel's always meant to do. But before he can do that, he needs to go through and take on the punishment that Israel endures.
Can I go on a small tangent?
Sure.
So
small. I go on the big tangent.
So the view was to get at Israel's repeated redemption of the world.
Yep.
And that day of age. So it was not a future thing, it was a continuous thing, continuous time. So can you extrapolate and say that we as Christians, that the body of Christ, in quotes, are not to fulfill that role?
We're the new Israel, yeah, absolutely.
But therefore also, it's not in a future sense, but
in the present sense, yeah.
sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, from the Abrahamic covenant, very get-go. Those who bless you, I will bless. Those who curse you, I will curse. Okay? The function of Abraham and his nation is meant to be a litmus test in the world, in which by reacting to this nation, you reveal yourself to be for God or against God. That was the mechanism by which the world to be blessed, and which always requires that Abraham and his people reflect God's character. If they don't, then we don't have a proper way to react to this. And that, through Israel, in complete failure, they are cursed, which means the Israel stops functioning at all. And now in Jesus, what does it say in John? Those who accept him, they are blessed, given the power to be children of God, and those who reject him, their sins they're already condemned. Right? Jesus becomes a new litmus test by which people reveal themselves by their interaction with Jesus. And then that role becomes taken on by the church. That role has never changed. It's the same mission, same vocation, all the way through Scripture. Okay. Which is kind of a lot of pressure. Yes. But which is why the promise of the Spirit is so important, right? Because Israel couldn't pull it off, but God's going to give a heck of a try by putting His Spirit in the church. I do that because the history of the church shows that the track record is...
Tongue in cheek.
Huh? Yeah.
Say it in tongue in cheek.
A little bit, yeah. Let's move on. Let's move on. Is that clear? This is one of the toughest passages in Galatians, guys. It's really hard. And there's a lot of different interpretations by them. I didn't bother summarizing all the different options, okay? I just gave you mine. And I apologize, but this is a hard passage, and this is the only way I can make sense of it. There are other ways that that doesn't make any sense. And it's really hard to make sense of these passages. So this is what I pull together commentaries and so okay, this I think makes sense to me. What's going on? I hope it makes sense to you. I hope it works for you. No questions. Okay, go ahead.
So in Deuteronomy, there's this elaborate description of all of these curses.
Yes.
Pretty specific. But I'm wondering, are some of those like metaphorical, like the ones that say like you'll go on ships back to Egypt? Like obviously, did they really everyone get on ships and go back to Egypt, or?
Yeah. What's interesting is like, oh, sorry, go ahead.
So I'm just wondering, like, because it seems, and throughout the story of God's interaction with Israel, it seems like God's like, I'm gonna curse you. Okay, I guess I won't curse you.
Yeah.
So, and then that covenant, it's that covenant relationship where he swears by himself and says, I will do this. So my question is like, does he just change his mind, or is it like a metaphorical speaking of the curse of the whole world?
You mean Deuteronomy 28?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, because it's like all of his curses, and then you see the children of Israel, and you're like, well,
It mostly happened. I mean, first of all, they did go back to Egypt. If you look at end of 2 Kings, and especially if look at the end of Jeremiah's story. So Jeremiah, once they got taken to the Babylonian exile, the elites were taken to Babylon. Jeremiah's like writing letters to them, like, okay, don't worry, you'll come back. You'll come back in 70 years. Don't worry, you will come back. And then he says, and then he's like, he even bought a piece of land in Canaan, in the Holy Land, like expressing his faith that they will all come back. And then what happens, of course, is some radical zealots murders Gedaliah, I think so, the governor imposed by Babylon. So, fearing retribution, a whole bunch of them ran away back to Egypt, kidnapping Jeremiah with them, because we need a prophet with us. He's like, I want to stay here because I bought a piece of land. I'm expressing my faith in God. They grab him and took him back to Egypt. And the story, it's just such a sad story for Jeremiah's life. Jeremiah's this poor prophet. Nobody buys it. And in the end, he's like, everything he proclaimed has come right, and he wants to live out his life in Palace in Canaan. And then they stick him back to Egypt. So the story of Israel begins really as a nation they leave Egypt and they go back to Egypt. Okay, it's like this. Oh wow, that's how the story ends. So the idea of Egypt thing, that's like right there. Yeah, they go right. Actually, if you want to go two directions. Abraham came out of the Chaldees, Ur of the Chaldees. So what you have is Abraham came this way, Israel out of this way, and they both go this way. Okay. The two places, the two dominant civilizations, Abraham and Moses, and they come together in the middle, and then they get destroyed and pulled back in both directions. And kind of like, just what happened, kind of thing, what happened.
So we could say that God did fulfill his part of the covenant by like letting those curses happen.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to put it this way, this is part of the covenant. I mean, the curse is part of the covenant, because that's actually what they agreed to. So, in order for the covenant, in order for the blessing part of the covenant to be operative again, there needs to be somebody who takes it on and absorb the curse so as to make a new Israel that's able to function the way it's supposed to. Yeah. So I would say the covenant did not end. I mean, that's what a lot of people question about, and the zealot prophets all say, no, the covenant continues on. It's just that you're in the curses portion of it, which you agreed to way back. So. Other questions?
I just want to check in as far as time. I'm getting a little concerned about.
Actually, we should be okay because we're not going to be able to finish all of chapter 3. So don't worry. We're actually about 4 slides away.
Okay, that sounds good. What
Sorry.
time is it?
It's 11:40. 11:40. So we're going about an hour and 46 minutes. So I think we're okay for a little. I think we can get through this. Sorry. Yeah, you're looking at chapter 3 like, well, this chapter 3 is really long, right? No. There's actually, the rest of it goes next week and blends with chapter 4 a bit, and there's going to be, it's going to work. Okay.
So the seed part is our last main topic, right?
Yes, exactly. So that's kind of how this ends. We want to receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. Okay. Brothers and sisters. Okay. He's still dealing with Abraham. We haven't left the issue of Abraham. Okay. Except he's going to make another argument now. Brothers and sisters, I speak in human terms. Even a human will, once ratified, no one annuls or adds to it. Now the promises were made to Abraham and to his seed. It does not say, and to seeds, referring to many, but referring to one. And to your seed, which is the Messiah. And this is what I mean. A covenant previously ratified by God that created 430 years later Torah. That's where he comes in, right? So he's like, this is just obvious. Cannot annul us to make the promise void. Torah is later. Okay, it's actually pretty obvious an argument to make. For is the inheritance, it is from the Torah. It is no longer from promise, but God gave it to Abraham by a promise. Okay. So, what about the Torah? Well, we need to continue this. First of all, a Torah cannot nullify the promise to Abraham. If God made a promise to Abraham, the Torah cannot come along and suddenly say, "Oh, you cannot supersede the original promise." Right? So, if a dead man's will cannot be overturned, how much less so the living God? Okay. Now the promise is made to Abraham and to his seed. Genesis 13. For all the land which you see, I will give to you and to your descendants forever. I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth. So blah 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 blah. Genesis 15. On that day, Yahweh made a covenant with Abraham, saying, "To your descendants, I give this land to the rivers of Egypt, the great river, the river Euphrates." 17. I will give you and to your descendants after you the land of your sojourning, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. Here's the problem. Descendants translate Hebrew word zerah. Zerah is what we call in Hebrew a collective noun. It is in a singular form. It could either mean seed or seeds. In English, they always translate this plural, but in Hebrew, it's actually singular in grammatical term. And surely, when people read Torah, they read zerah and they understood as descendants. And Paul says, "Nah, you're all wrong. It's actually a single seed. Just one person." Okay? That is interesting, isn't it? So Paul comes along and says, okay, the promise is given to Abraham, and let's look at the promises again. Okay, what exactly is the promise? As the single seed is going to be is going to take the land forever. And the single seed is going to receive the land, is going to receive possession, and eventually, the promise of the covenant, which is the blessing of the nation. It all goes to the single seed. And so this single seed does not refer to many, but receives only one, which is the Messiah. Okay? He's going to get the whole thing. And that promise is given him, and no Torah that comes later can supersede that. Okay? We have a promise, and let me think so I say this right. We think the entrance into that, into this seed. Interest in the seed doesn't make any sense. How do we talk about this? Because we're gonna hit this later. I'm preempting you by what he'll talk about later about being baptized into his crucifixion and his resurrection. Let me stop here. The seed is defined by promise, not by Torah. Maybe that's the best way to put it. So God has given the covenant via promise, and you cannot have a Torah later that shows up and make that the requirement of the promise. I think that's a simple way of putting it. Does that make sense? So he's still making his argument. If you want to pull this within the argument of the Abrahamic covenant, who are the children of Abraham? The children of Abraham are people who share his faith, that are born of faith. And by the way, it only applies to one person, aside from Abraham, the Messiah.
So how does he go with seed when isn't it part in Genesis where it's saying that it will be, that we can't be beyond counted? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I know. So which gets into really interesting question, doesn't it? What does it mean for Jesus to be beyond counting? Except to say that he's going to get into the oneness of Jesus. That when we become one, see, Jesus is going to be himself a collective. Jesus is going to be a collective. Sounds like the board. That's not like the board.
But
yes.
All the descendants are from Isaac only.
Right, but what I'm getting at is all the people who become Christians and joining the Abrahamic covenant are actually entering through Jesus as the singular seed.
But they're referring to Genesis, and that's really,
yeah.
It has to be plural to be counted and countless. But then the descendants, they're all from one single seed, which is Isaac.
It's a good question. How Paul is doing here. Paul seems to be saying that the promises made to Abraham refers to Abraham and a single seed, and that single seed is actually the Messiah. So how can it then be? How can you get no gone and counted or uncountable as in this number of the stars? Paul doesn't get into that, does he? He kind of skips out on that part. And I would say the way you deal with that, I think he would deal with as being, we're all in Christ. We're in that one seed. Therefore, we're not we're the multitude that he's referring to.
That's a big trick from God, isn't it?
Yeah.
To put the word seed and then just treated heroes for hundreds of years into believing that it meant them.
Yeah. Anyway, but do you remember? Okay. Yeah, but so this is kind of where we're headed. I don't think what he means by that is that it's bypassing the Jews, as much as I think he's saying that the promise is fully fulfilled in the seed. Because right? Because you have the promise to be a blessing to the nations. That's a promise that God's going to make happen. Well, it didn't happen with Israel. They got involved in a Torah covenant in which they became the cursed people. Okay? But there's still a promise out there that God has made that Abraham is going to have a seed or seeds who are going to bless the nations. So there is that one person. And God's promise, God's going to achieve that one, not via the Torah. Okay? And all people who join in, all the Gentiles who join in, and the blessing of this seed, they're going to come in not through the Torah either. Other questions? We're going to stop here. So, yeah, good place to start. It's a lot of stuff. And we only did like 18 verses. Sorry.
Is he going to go on to talk about what the purpose of the Torah was?
Yes, it's coming up. The whole children Paideon thing. That's the big question. Yeah, it is the question. I mean, it's like, what if that's the case? What's the point of the Torah? Yeah, the Jewish question is huge in Romans and Galatians, all over the place. It was one of the biggest questions that afflicted the early first century. So
that's why it's a stumbling block.
It's a big problem. Yeah, it's a huge problem. Yeah, and we're going to find out what the law is actually, the Torah is actually for.